Miss Middleton here. I love ecological succession, so let's jump in. Ecological succession is the start of life or the rebounding of life after a disruption to an ecosystem. There are two main types of ecological succession. There's primary succession and secondary succession. One of the obvious differences between primary and secondary succession is how they start. Primary succession starts as bare rock, where secondary succession is characterized as already having soil formed in an area, and therefore an area experiencing secondary succession might bounce back more quickly than an area that has been stripped down to its bedrock. As you can see from this image, primary succession is the growth or regrowth of an ecosystem when there is bare rock. There is no soil, and the only way to have different plant life reappear is to begin the process of soil formation. This is where lichens come in as a pioneer species. They may move into an unoccupied habitat and over time adapt to that region's conditions. This can also result in the origin of new species, as they change the chemistry of the rock and soil. Before we go further, I have to admit I love lichen. They are formed from a mutualistic relationship between algae living within fungi. They are this weird hybrid that acts like a plant at times, but because of their mutualistic characteristics, aren't considered a plant. They can live just about anywhere and can be used to date rocks. The part that we are interested in, though, is how they break down rock. Obviously, they can break down rock physically, growing in the cracks of a rock and whatnot, but they have found that lichens also break down the rock chemically. These organisms are amazing because they can take a rock and break it down to create soil, which is essential for everything else. Just as a heads up, your pioneer species are going to be fast-growing organisms. The image that was added on top of the original image is an example of primary succession in Hawaii. You have a lava flow wiping out the previous plant life and covering any soil there would have been. Another example of where primary succession could be found would be in areas where glaciation has happened. Ice will bulldoze any trees, plants, or soil out of an area and leave an area when it melts with the bedrock. After soil has started to form, you'll have protists and invertebrates move into the area, continuing to make the soil more suitable for different plants. It's this beautiful negative feedback loop as soil is creating new organisms arrive, which will change the chemical and physical features of the soil, preparing it for the new organisms to arrive, which will change the chemical and physical features of the soil, and so on until a climax community is achieved. Therefore, as succession continues in a disturbed ecosystem, the total biomass, species richness, and net productivity will change and increase over time. It's beautiful. The intermediate species are shade-intolerant trees. Obviously, pine trees do best in certain regions, such as latitudes closer to the poles. But in areas where we are, or where temperate forests will grow, pine trees are indicators that a forest is still growing and is not yet mature. As the oak and hickory trees grow, they will put shade on the pine trees and effectively take advantage of that limiting factor, pushing out the pine and having trees such as oak and hickory become dominant. Secondary succession, you will notice, can be much quicker than primary succession. Of course, it depends on the climate of the area, but secondary succession can rebound to a climax community within 150 years, whereas primary succession will take hundreds of years. After a fire, for example, you will still have the soil that was originally there, and therefore you don't have as great of a need for lichen as a pioneer species. You will still have plants and organisms that help decompose and put nutrients into the ground, creating suitable soil for the next plant type to come. Secondary succession might happen with a fire, like we talked about, development of an area, harvesting, or a hurricane. The main difference between your primary and secondary succession is whether there is soil or not initially. As an ecosystem is recovering from a disturbance, there are specific species that are important to become aware of. Any keystone species in an ecosystem will be important because its activities have a particular significant role in determining community structure. They are special because if a keystone species was taken out of an ecosystem, no other species will be able to fill its place. Because of this, an ecosystem that loses its keystone species will change dramatically, either disappearing altogether or could be invaded with invasive species. Examples of keystone species would be the wolves in Yellowstone, the starfish in Washington State's coast, and elephants in the savanna. All of these species keep the other species around them in check so that the balance within a food web is maintained. An indicator species is a plant or animal that, by its presence, abundance, scarcity, or chemical composition, demonstrates some distinctive aspect of the character or quality of an ecosystem present. For example, moss indicates that the soil is acidic where it is growing. Tubifex worms indicate that a waterway has low oxygen. And lichen are sensitive to heavy metals, or acid and rain could indicate air pollution. Amphibians in an area are typically excellent at indicating the health of a waterway since they begin their life in water when they are young and developing. They also have very thin skin and react quickly to pollution. As I was looking up images for amphibians and indicator species, there are some pretty gross pictures of how they can grow mutations. Frogs with extra limbs and whatnot. So if you're bored of me talking and need something weird to look at, check out frogs or amphibians as indicator species. Speaking of becoming bored, this is the end of our Intro to Ecological Succession. Remember, you can always email your teacher if you have questions or bring your questions to class. Thanks, and have a good one.